Sometimes the loudest cry in a room is not asking to be silenced, it is asking to feel safe. The dinner service had barely begun when every conversation inside the harbor room quietly faded beneath the desperate cries of a little boy. Crystal glasses stood untouched. Waiters froze in place. Soft piano music continued drifting through the elegant restaurant, but it could no longer compete with the heartbreaking sound echoing beneath the vaulted ceiling. Guests exchanged uncertain glances, while parents instinctively looked toward the child with sympathetic expressions. At the center of the room stood Daniel Park, a respected Korean businessman whose calm presence usually settled every situation before anyone else even noticed it. Tonight, nothing seemed to work. His 5-year-old son, Ethan, clung tightly to the sleeve of his small sweater, tears streaming down his face, despite every gentle attempt to comfort him. A trusted nanny knelt beside him with familiar toys. A family physician quietly checked for signs of illness. Even Daniel lowered himself to one knee, speaking softly in Korean, and then English, hoping the sound of his own voice might calm the child. Nothing changed. The little boy continued crying as though something invisible had wrapped itself around his tiny heart. Daniel's face remained composed, but anyone paying close attention could see the concern hidden behind his steady expression. He was a father before he was anything else, and at that moment, every achievement in his life felt painfully unimportant. Near the entrance to the dining room, Alicia Brooks balanced a serving tray against one hand while watching from a respectful distance. She had worked at the restaurant for nearly 4 years and had learned that some moments required silence more than speed. She noticed something the others did not. Every person trying to comfort the little boy leaned toward him too quickly. Too many unfamiliar hands, too many anxious voices, too many desperate attempts to make the crying stop instead of helping him feel secure. Alicia quietly set the tray onto a nearby service station and walked toward the restaurant manager. "May I try something?" she asked gently. The manager hesitated before looking toward Daniel, who appeared exhausted by helplessness more than embarrassment. After a brief pause, the manager quietly approached him and relayed Alicia's request. Daniel looked across the room toward the waitress he had barely noticed earlier that evening. She stood several feet away, making no sudden movements, simply waiting with remarkable patience. Desperation made room for trust. Daniel nodded once. Alicia slowly approached without speaking. Instead of reaching for the child, she lowered herself until she sat on the carpet a comfortable distance away, placing herself below his eye level rather than above it. She rested her hands loosely in her lap and waited. Nearly 20 seconds passed without a single word. The restaurant remained completely still. Ethan's cries gradually softened into uneven breaths as his curious eyes lifted toward the quiet stranger, who seemed in no hurry to change him. Alicia smiled warmly, but never moved closer until the little boy took one hesitant step toward her on his own. Only then did she gently open her arms without asking anything of him. After one long moment of uncertainty, Ethan quietly leaned against her shoulder. Almost instantly, the crying stopped. The silence that followed seemed even louder than the tears had been. Guests stared in disbelief. The nanny slowly lowered the stuffed bear she had been holding. The physician stepped back with quiet relief. Daniel remained motionless, unable to understand how a woman who had never met his son had accomplished in a single peaceful minute what no one else had managed all evening. As Ethan rested comfortably against Alicia's shoulder with calm, steady breathing, Daniel realized this could not simply be coincidence. And for the first time that night, the question that filled his mind was no longer how to stop his son's tears, but who this remarkable woman truly was. 2 days before the unforgettable evening at the harbor room, Alicia Brooks followed the same routine she had repeated for nearly 4 years. She arrived before sunrise, greeted the kitchen staff by name, tied on her apron, and quietly helped prepare the dining room before the first guests walked through the front doors. She polished silverware until every piece reflected the morning light, arranged fresh flowers on each table, and always paused for a brief moment to straighten the crayons and coloring books the restaurant kept for young visitors. Most people never noticed those small details, but Alicia believed children deserved to feel welcome long before anyone served the first meal. Her co-workers often joked that every child who entered the restaurant somehow found their way to Alicia's section. She never hurried them. She never spoke louder than necessary. If a nervous toddler hid behind a parent's leg, Alicia simply smiled and greeted the parent first, instead of demanding the child's attention. If a young guest accidentally spilled a drink, she knelt beside the table and quietly cleaned the mess without making anyone feel embarrassed. Parents thanked her almost every day, but she always answered with the same gentle smile. Every family is carrying something we cannot see. Kindness costs nothing. Late one afternoon, a young mother entered the restaurant with twin boys who looked exhausted after a long day. One child climbed happily into his chair, but the other buried his face against his mother's shoulder, refusing to let go. Several guests glanced over with impatient expressions as soft whimpers filled the room. Before anyone could complain, Alicia approached the table slowly, placed a small paper menu on the edge of the table instead of directly in front of the child, and spoke to the mother rather than to the frightened little boy. "Take your time," she said warmly. "I will come back whenever you are ready." 10 minutes later, when she returned with warm rolls fresh from the oven, the little boy was sitting quietly, drawing a picture with the crayons she had left behind. Her co-workers watched the simple exchange with admiration. They had seen scenes like that many times, yet none of them could fully explain why children relax so naturally around her. During her break, Alicia sat outside behind the restaurant with a paperback novel and a cup of tea. Her friend and fellow server, Megan Collins, joined her with a sandwich and smiled knowingly. "You have that look again," Megan teased. Alicia laughed softly. "What look?" "The one that says you spent your entire shift taking care of everyone except yourself." Alicia shrugged gently. Children do not always need someone to solve their problems. Sometimes they just need one person who is not trying to rush them. Megan nodded thoughtfully before changing the subject, but the conversation lingered in her mind. Inside the restaurant, the manager posted the reservation list for the coming weekend. One private booking immediately caught everyone's attention because it required additional security and complete discretion. A prominent businessman would be dining with his young son. The staff quietly reviewed the special instructions while continuing with their work. Alicia glanced at the reservation only long enough to remember the table number before returning to her evening responsibilities. To her, every guest deserved the same respect regardless of reputation or status. She had no way of knowing that within 48 hours, one quiet decision made in the middle of a crowded dining room would forever connect her life with a father searching for answers, and a little boy whose tears had become impossible for anyone else to understand. The following evening, Daniel returned to the harbor room with a decision he could not fully explain even to himself. He told his assistant it was simply because his son had enjoyed the restaurant, but deep inside, he knew that was only part of the truth. Since the previous night, Ethan had spoken about only one person, not the elegant dining room, not the dessert the chef had prepared especially for him, not the toys the nanny had packed into a small leather bag. Every few hours, he quietly asked the same question. "Is the nice lady working today?" Daniel never answered immediately because he was still trying to understand why his son had formed such an immediate sense of trust with someone they had only met once. When they arrived, the restaurant looked much as it always had. Soft piano music drifted through the room. Candlelight reflected across polished glass. Guests spoke in low voices while servers moved with practiced confidence between tables. Alicia greeted another family near the entrance, before noticing Daniel and Ethan being escorted toward a private table. She smiled politely, exactly as she greeted every guest, never assuming they expected special attention. Before anyone could sit down, Ethan gently slipped his hand free from his father's and walked across the dining room toward her. The little boy stopped only a few feet away, looking up with hopeful eyes. Alicia lowered herself until she was once again at his eye level. "Hello, Ethan," she said warmly. "I am happy to see you again." The little boy smiled without hesitation, the nervous tension that had filled him the night before nowhere to be found. Daniel watched every movement with careful attention. Alicia never reached toward Ethan first. She allowed him to decide how close he wanted to stand. She asked simple questions about the toy truck he carried, instead of asking why he had cried the night before. Within minutes, Ethan began describing the bright red truck, the imaginary roads he had built at home, and the bridge he planned to add with colorful building blocks. His voice carried an excitement Daniel had not heard in weeks. Throughout dinner, Ethan remained unusually peaceful. He ate without encouragement, laughed when Alicia remembered that he preferred extra strawberries with his fruit, and proudly showed her a drawing he had folded inside his jacket pocket. It was a picture of a large tree with two people standing beneath it. One figure was much smaller than the other. Alicia admired the drawing as though it belonged in an art gallery. "I like the sunshine you added," she said gently. Ethan nodded. "Sunshine makes people feel better." Daniel quietly lowered his eyes. He wondered how many conversations like this he had unknowingly missed while answering phone calls or reviewing contracts during dinner. As the evening came to an end, Ethan looked toward his father before asking a question that settled over the table with surprising weight. "Can we come back next week?" Daniel glanced toward Alicia, who was carefully clearing another table without realizing she had become the center of his son's growing sense of safety. He answered softly, "If you would like to, we will." Ethan smiled with complete certainty before taking his father's hand. As they walked toward the exit, Daniel looked back one final time. Alicia was helping an elderly couple with their coats, offering the same patience and kindness she had shown every person throughout the evening. There was nothing dramatic about her actions, no secret technique, no extraordinary performance. Yet Daniel could not ignore what he had witnessed twice in 2 days. His son was not responding to comfort alone. He was responding to someone who made the world feel calm enough to trust again. And for the first time since becoming a father, Daniel realized there might be lessons about love and safety that no amount of success had ever taught him. Over the next several visits, Daniel stopped searching for an explanation that sounded impressive because every answer he observed seemed remarkably ordinary. Alicia never carried special toys. She never distracted Ethan with treats or games. She never interrupted his feelings or rushed him to smile. Instead, she practiced the same quiet habits every single time. When Ethan entered the restaurant, she always greeted him from a comfortable distance before allowing him to decide whether to come closer. If he wanted to show her a drawing, she studied every detail with genuine interest. If he remained quiet, she sat beside him in peaceful silence without trying to fill every moment with conversation. Daniel found himself watching these simple interactions more carefully than he had ever studied any business negotiation. One rainy evening after the dinner rush had slowed, Ethan quietly built a small bridge from sugar packets and folded napkins while waiting for dessert. The structure collapsed twice, and the little boy frowned with disappointment. Before Daniel could step in to fix it, Alicia knelt beside the table. She did not rebuild the bridge for him. She simply slid one extra napkin within his reach and asked, "Would you like another piece to make the foundation stronger?" Ethan looked at the bridge, thought for several seconds, then carefully started again by himself. When the final piece remained standing, his face brightened with quiet pride. Alicia smiled. "You figured it out." Daniel noticed that she had praised the effort instead of the result. On the drive home, Ethan fell asleep in the back seat, holding the tiny paper bridge inside his hands. Daniel glanced toward the rearview mirror before asking the family nanny a question that had stayed with him all evening. "Did you notice anything different?" She nodded thoughtfully. "She never takes control away from him. She gives it back to him." Those words remained in Daniel's thoughts for days. Curious to understand more, he arrived at the restaurant earlier than usual the following week. From a quiet corner of the dining room, he watched Alicia interact with several families before his own table was seated. A shy little girl refused to remove her winter coat. Alicia simply complimented the colorful buttons instead of asking her to take it off. A young boy became frustrated while trying to color inside the lines. Alicia picked up another page and happily colored outside the lines herself before laughing gently. The little boy immediately relaxed. Every interaction followed the same pattern. She observed first, she listened second, she acted last. There was no hurry, no pressure, and no desire to impress anyone. Later that evening, after Ethan happily waved goodbye, Daniel remained behind while his assistant escorted the little boy to the car with the nanny. Alicia was collecting menus when Daniel approached. "I hope you do not mind me asking something," he said politely. She looked up with the same calm expression she always carried. "Not at all." Daniel hesitated before speaking. "Everyone has been trying to comfort my son for months. You met him once, and something changed almost immediately. How?" Alicia smiled gently, as though the answer were much simpler than he expected. "Children usually tell us what they need before they ever find the words to say it. Most adults become so busy trying to stop the crying that they forget to notice what caused it." Daniel stood quietly, absorbing her words. They were not dramatic. They contained no secret formula, yet somehow they explained more than every expert opinion he had collected over the past year. As Alicia returned to preparing the dining room for the next group of guests, Daniel realized he had spent months searching for someone who could fix his son, when perhaps what his son had needed all along was someone willing to slow down long enough to truly see him. Several days later, Daniel found himself paying attention to moments he had overlooked for years. Instead of asking only whether Ethan had eaten well or followed his daily schedule, he began asking different questions during the drive home. What made you smile today? Was anything difficult? What was your favorite part of the afternoon? At first, Ethan answered with only a few words, before looking back out the window. Daniel accepted every short answer without pressing for more. He remembered Alicia's quiet patience and realized trust was never built by rushing another person. One Saturday morning, while helping Ethan organize his toy shelves, Daniel accidentally knocked over a wooden box filled with small paper drawings. Colored pencils scattered across the rug as dozens of folded pictures slipped onto the floor. Ethan immediately rushed over, gathering each drawing with surprising care. Daniel noticed that almost every page showed the same scene. A large tree stood beneath a bright yellow sun, while a little boy held hands with a tall adult. Sometimes there was a bird resting on the branches. Sometimes there was a small wooden bridge nearby. Daniel smiled gently as he picked up one drawing that looked slightly older than the rest. "Who is this?" he asked. Ethan studied the picture before pointing to the taller figure. "That is you." Daniel's smile grew warmer. Then he pointed toward the little boy. "And that is you." Ethan nodded proudly, before looking toward another drawing tucked beneath the others. This time the picture showed 3 people beneath the same tree. Daniel quietly lifted it into the sunlight. The third figure wore a simple apron and carried a serving tray. "Alicia," Ethan whispered with complete certainty. Daniel remained silent for several moments. He realized Alicia had become part of the place where his son felt safe, not because she had replaced anyone, but because she had entered his world with patience instead of expectations. That afternoon, Daniel returned to the harbor room alone, while Ethan spent the day with his grandmother. Alicia was arranging fresh flowers near the front entrance when she noticed him. She greeted him with the same kindness she offered every guest. Daniel thanked her for everything she had done without realizing it. Alicia shook her head gently. "Your son is doing the hard work," she replied. "He is learning that grown-ups can listen." Daniel hesitated before asking another question that had quietly followed him for days. "Were you always this patient with children?" Alicia smiled thoughtfully while adjusting a vase of white lilies. "Not always," she admitted. "Patience is something life taught me one small lesson at a time." Before Daniel could ask another question, Megan Collins walked past, carrying folded table linens. She smiled warmly at Alicia before turning toward Daniel. "She is being modest," Megan said with a quiet laugh. Alicia spent most of her teenage years helping care for her younger brother after he struggled with overwhelming anxiety following a difficult season in their family. She learned that forcing someone to feel calm almost never works. Feeling understood usually comes first. Alicia lowered her eyes with gentle embarrassment, but did not interrupt. Daniel listened carefully, finally understanding that her compassion had not appeared by accident. It had been shaped by years of ordinary moments that demanded patience instead of quick solutions. As he prepared to leave, Daniel glanced once more around the peaceful dining room. For the first time, he no longer believed he had discovered someone with extraordinary abilities. He had simply met a woman whose quiet kindness had been strengthened by experience, and he wondered how different his own relationship with Ethan might become if he learned to practice that same kind of patient presence every single day. The following Monday marked the first morning in months that Daniel postponed his earliest meeting instead of asking someone else to adjust Ethan's schedule. He drove his son to kindergarten himself, something the family chauffeur usually handled without question. The drive was quiet at first. Morning sunlight reflected across the windshield, while soft instrumental music played through the speakers. Daniel resisted the familiar urge to fill every silence with instructions or reminders. Instead, he simply stayed present. After several minutes, Ethan pointed toward a construction crew repairing a small neighborhood bridge. "They are making it stronger," he said thoughtfully. Daniel smiled. "Sometimes strong things need extra support too." Ethan nodded as though the answer made perfect sense. When they arrived at school, Daniel walked beside his son instead of hurrying toward the entrance. Ethan paused beside a flower bed where a butterfly rested on a yellow blossom. Most mornings, Daniel would have gently encouraged him to keep moving because of the time. Today, he stopped beside him and waited. After watching the butterfly flutter away, Ethan quietly slipped his small hand into his father's. It lasted only a few seconds before he ran toward his classroom, but Daniel carried that brief moment with him throughout the day. Later that afternoon, he returned home earlier than usual and found the playroom exactly as Ethan had left it the night before. Colorful blocks covered one corner of the rug. Toy trains circled a wooden track. Daniel remembered something Alicia had once done without drawing attention to it. She always entered Ethan's world before inviting him into hers. Instead of calling his son downstairs, Daniel sat on the floor and began building a simple tower from wooden blocks. He made no announcement. He did not ask Ethan to join him. Several minutes later, small footsteps appeared at the doorway. Ethan watched silently before picking up another block and placing it beside the tower. Daniel smiled without offering praise too quickly. They continued building together, occasionally exchanging ideas, but never competing. When the tower finally leaned too far and collapsed across the rug, Ethan looked up nervously, expecting disappointment. Daniel laughed softly instead. "That was an interesting experiment," he said. "Should we see what happens if we make the base wider?" Ethan's face brightened with relief. They rebuilt the tower 3 more times before dinner, discovering together that every stronger foundation required patience rather than speed. During the meal, Ethan spoke more than he had in weeks, describing his classmates, the butterfly, and the tallest tower they had almost completed. The nanny quietly exchanged a surprised smile with the housekeeper. Neither woman interrupted. They simply watched a father and son finding each other through ordinary conversation. That evening, after Ethan had fallen asleep clutching one of the small wooden blocks he insisted would remind him of tomorrow's tower, Daniel returned to the harbor room. Alicia was wiping down the final table before closing. He thanked her again, but this time his gratitude sounded different. "I tried something today," he said. "I stopped trying to fix every moment. I simply stayed with him." Alicia's smile reflected quiet encouragement rather than surprise. "Children usually remember how we made them feel, long before they remember what we said," she replied gently. Daniel looked through the restaurant window toward the city lights beyond the harbor. For the first time since his son's tears had filled this room, he realized the greatest lesson had never been about comforting a frightened child. It had been about becoming the kind of father whose calm presence allowed that child to feel safe enough to smile again. The quiet changes inside Daniel's home became impossible to ignore as spring settled over the city. Morning routines no longer began with hurried instructions from assistants or carefully planned schedules pinned to the refrigerator. Instead, they began with breakfast shared around the kitchen island, where Ethan proudly poured orange juice into his own cup, while Daniel patiently waited through every careful movement, even when a few drops landed on the countertop. What once would have been corrected immediately was now simply part of learning together. Every evening brought another small tradition. Sometimes they read picture books beneath a blanket on the living room floor. Other nights they walked through the neighborhood park, counting ducks along the pond, or stopping to watch dogs chasing tennis balls across the grass. Daniel gradually discovered that children measured love differently than adults. They did not count expensive gifts or impressive achievements. They remembered who stayed beside them when the world felt uncertain. One Friday afternoon, Daniel arrived at Ethan's kindergarten earlier than usual after receiving an invitation to the annual family art exhibition. Colorful paintings covered every classroom wall, each one created around the same theme: the person who makes me feel safe. Parents wandered slowly between displays, smiling proudly as teachers described the children's work. Daniel quietly searched the walls until he found Ethan's painting. It showed a large green tree beneath a bright blue sky. Standing under the branches were 2 figures holding hands. The taller person wore a dark blue jacket, while the smaller figure held a tiny paper bridge above his head. In the corner, a butterfly floated above yellow flowers. Daniel smiled warmly, believing he understood the picture immediately. Then he noticed another figure standing a short distance away. She wore a simple apron and held a serving tray. Beneath the painting, Ethan had carefully printed a sentence in large, uneven letters. "The nice lady showed my dad how to stay with me." Daniel felt his throat tighten. His eyes remained fixed on those simple words, long after other parents continued walking through the classroom. They were not only a child's gratitude, they were a reminder that real change had begun, the moment someone quietly demonstrated what presence looked like. That evening, Daniel brought Ethan to the harbor room once again. Alicia welcomed them with the same gentle smile that had never changed from the first day they met. Before anyone ordered dinner, Ethan reached into his backpack and carefully removed the painting from a protective folder. "I made this for you," he said proudly. Alicia accepted it with both hands, as though receiving something priceless. She studied every detail before smiling at Ethan. "This is beautiful. Thank you for sharing it with me." Ethan beamed with quiet happiness before returning to his seat. Daniel watched the exchange without speaking. After dinner, while Ethan waited near the entrance with the nanny, Daniel approached Alicia one more time. He did not offer money, expensive gifts, or extravagant praise. He simply looked at the painting resting carefully beside the restaurant's front desk. "You changed more than my son's life," he said softly. "You changed mine." Alicia shook her head with quiet humility. "Children have a wonderful way of teaching adults what truly matters," she replied. "Sometimes they just need someone willing to notice." Daniel smiled thoughtfully before looking toward Ethan, who was laughing as he tried to balance along the edge of a stone planter outside the restaurant. For the first time in many months, his son was not looking back to make sure someone would follow him. He already knew his father was there, and that quiet certainty became the most meaningful gift either of them had ever received. Several weeks passed, and the harbor room quietly became more than a restaurant to Daniel and Ethan. It became a place where ordinary evenings reminded them how much life could change through simple acts of patience. Daniel never expected Alicia to become part of their family's routine, yet every visit strengthened his belief that her compassion deserved to reach far beyond a single dining room. One afternoon, while reviewing proposals for his family's charitable foundation, he paused at a report describing the growing number of community programs supporting children experiencing anxiety, grief, and emotional hardship. He read every page slowly before closing the folder. For the first time, the project was no longer just another opportunity for philanthropy. It had become deeply personal. The following evening, after dinner service had ended and the final guests began leaving, Daniel asked Alicia whether she had a few minutes to talk before heading home. She agreed, assuming he simply wished to thank the staff once again. They sat at a small table near the front window, where the city lights reflected across the harbor. Daniel placed a neatly organized folder on the table, but did not slide it toward her immediately. Instead, he spoke with complete sincerity. "The greatest lesson my son and I learned this year did not come from a boardroom, a consultant, or a specialist. It came from watching someone treat people with patience every single day." Alicia listened quietly without interrupting. Daniel continued, "My family foundation has been planning to expand its work with children and parents across the city. We want to create welcoming spaces where families can learn practical ways to build trust, confidence, and healthy communication together. I would like you to help shape that work." Alicia looked at him with genuine surprise. "I am only a waitress," she answered softly. Daniel smiled with quiet certainty. "You are someone who understands people. Titles cannot teach that." Alicia lowered her eyes for a thoughtful moment before looking back toward him. "I have never managed a program like that." Daniel nodded. "I am not asking you to become someone different. I am asking you to continue being exactly who you already are. Everything else can be learned." Before Alicia could answer, Megan stepped out from the kitchen carrying her handbag after finishing her shift. She noticed the serious conversation and walked over with a curious smile. Daniel briefly explained the opportunity. Megan laughed warmly before looking at Alicia. "If anyone can help families feel seen, it is you. You have been doing it every day since I met you." Alicia looked through the restaurant toward a young father helping his daughter put on her coat before they stepped into the cool evening air. The little girl reached up for her father's hand, and he immediately slowed his pace to match hers. Alicia smiled quietly at the simple scene. It reminded her why small moments mattered. She finally turned back toward Daniel. "If this helps more parents understand their children, then I would be honored to help." Daniel extended his hand, not to celebrate a business agreement, but to acknowledge a shared purpose. As they shook hands, neither of them imagined how many families would one day benefit from a decision born not from ambition or recognition, but from one frightened little boy whose tears had led two strangers to discover that kindness, when shared with patience, could quietly grow into something far greater than either of them had ever expected. 1 year later, the small community family center opened its doors on a bright spring morning beneath a clear blue sky. Children laughed across the playground while parents gathered beneath newly planted maple trees, talking quietly over coffee as volunteers welcomed every family by name. There were no marble floors, private dining rooms, or impressive displays of wealth. The building was simple, warm, and filled with sunlight pouring through wide windows that overlooked a colorful garden planted by neighborhood volunteers. Inside the entrance hung dozens of children's drawings, celebrating the people who made them feel safe. Among them was one familiar picture of a large green tree, a small paper bridge, and 3 figures standing together beneath the branches. Ethan had insisted that it belonged on the first wall every visitor would see. Daniel stood near the entrance watching families arrive one after another. He no longer measured success by contracts completed or meetings attended. Instead, he found himself smiling every time he saw a nervous child slowly relax after being greeted with patience instead of pressure. Alicia moved naturally through the center, welcoming every family with the same quiet kindness she had once offered inside the harbor room. She knelt beside frightened children instead of towering over them. She listened before speaking. She waited instead of rushing. Nothing about her had changed, except the number of lives her compassion now reached. During the afternoon, a young father arrived carrying his daughter who refused to let go of his shoulder. The little girl buried her face against him while tears quietly filled her eyes. Daniel instinctively looked toward Alicia, remembering the first evening he had watched his own son cry without finding comfort. Alicia smiled gently but did not step forward. Instead, she glanced toward Daniel and gave him a small encouraging nod. Understanding her silent invitation, Daniel slowly approached the father and knelt until he was level with the little girl. He spoke softly, leaving plenty of quiet space between each sentence. He did not ask her to stop crying. He simply told her she was safe and that she could take all the time she needed. After several long moments, the little girl peeked over her father's shoulder before slowly reaching toward the basket of crayons resting beside the welcome table. Daniel smiled warmly but allowed her to choose the next step herself. From across the room, Alicia watched with quiet pride. Ethan, now happier and more confident than he had been a year earlier, stood beside her holding a paper bridge he had folded that morning. He looked up with a grin. "My dad remembered." Alicia nodded gently. Yes, he did. Later that afternoon, as the final families prepared to leave, Daniel joined Alicia beneath the flowering maple tree outside the center. Children chased bubbles across the lawn, while parents laughed together nearby. Daniel looked around at the peaceful scene before speaking. "I used to believe protecting my son meant solving every problem before he ever felt afraid. Now I know the greatest gift I can give him is staying beside him when life becomes difficult." Alicia smiled as a gentle breeze carried flower petals across the garden. "Sometimes feeling safe does not begin with having all the answers," she replied. "Sometimes it begins with knowing someone will not walk away." Daniel quietly looked toward Ethan, who was helping another little boy finish building a paper bridge across a small stream beside the garden path. The child who had once filled an entire restaurant with tears was now patiently encouraging someone else to keep trying after the bridge collapsed for the second time. Daniel felt a quiet gratitude settle into his heart. One ordinary act of kindness had become a lesson passed from one person to another, then from one family to many more. As the evening sun cast long golden shadows across the garden, the laughter of children replaced memories of frightened cries, and everyone who stepped through those welcoming doors carried home the same quiet truth. The strongest hearts are not the ones that never break, but the ones that help others feel safe enough to heal.